In the last video, Saul, a king? Really? We were introduced to Saul, who is in fact Israel's first king. We noticed how the text is ambiguous about him, and we leave this first impression wondering if he's going to work out or if Saul's going to end up a failure as king. Now, for those of you not familiar with Saul's story, I apologize for the spoiler that I'm about to dish out, but trust me that it's necessary. Saul will end up a failure as Israel's first king. The majority of Bible studies present him as a one-dimensional example of a man doomed to fail due to his own shortcomings. Here's a sample from one study on my shelf, The Principles from the Kings of the Old Testament. From the chapter on Saul titled Saul, The Folly of Not Following God. It says, Saul had the outside appearance of a king, but he lacked the right stuff on the inside. His poor self-image, his jealousy, his vengeful attitudes all speak of a man who would rule out of self-interest instead of serving the people by leading them and following God. Now, that's a completely negative portrait, but in my experience, it's pretty typical of how most Bible studies present Saul. And there's good reason for this. If you were to read Saul's story to its sad conclusion in chapter 31, you would see a steady and miserable unraveling of King Saul into jealousy and paranoia, distance from God and military defeat, especially after David enters the scene. Robert Alter, a distinguished scholar of the Hebrew Bible out of UC Berkeley, says Saul is the closest approximation of a tragic hero in the Hebrew Bible. It's hard to argue with this summation. In fact, I really like Alter's description because I believe that Saul had the makings of a hero within him. Things just went tragically sideways, starting very early on. So let's go back to those first days where Saul's rule is in its infancy. Samuel the prophet plays an instrumental role here because he's the current voice of authority in Israel. In fact, perhaps Samuel is the key to a successful transition, because he embodies the old guard, the former way of governing through the judges. But that era, it's passing away, and the era of monarchy is emerging. This first king, he needs Samuel's blessing, his guidance, his wisdom, and most importantly, he needs his ability to hear and communicate God's will. Now, no doubt, what Samuel's being asked to do is not easy. He's yielding all that he has worked to establish to somebody else for them to do things in their way. It's like retiring after decades of building your company and giving the reins over to a new CEO. This kind of thing requires a lot of self-denial, humility, and surrender. And the more you love the thing you're giving over, the harder it is. But wouldn't you agree that whether a company or it's a nation, it's so much better off if their new leader can find guidance rather than opposition when looking to the former one? So let's see what kind of resource Saul finds in Samuel. Chapter 9 tells us that God very clearly points out Saul as the one to be anointed king. Verse 17 says, when Samuel caught sight of Saul, the Lord said to him, "This is the man I spoke to you about. He will govern my people." So Samuel anoints Saul king in chapter 10 and gives him 3 rather odd predictions. You're going to meet 2 men who will tell you your dad's worried about you. Some random guys are going to offer you 2 loaves of bread and you should take them. And as you approach your hometown of Gibeah, you're going to meet some prophets. The Spirit of the Lord is going to come upon you and you'll prophesy with them in some kind of ecstatic display. And lots of people are going to witness this. All these predictions come true. But what is their purpose? We might read this to say that Samuel is demonstrating to Saul that he can be trusted because his predictions come true. Therefore, Saul can trust that when Samuel tells Saul that he's going to be the new king, that he really is. It might just be as simple as that. Or maybe Samuel, though he's obedient to anoint Saul, wants to make it very clear to Saul that he still holds the strings here. If I say you're going to prophesy, then by golly, you will. You might be king, but don't lose sight of who God's still talking to. Do you see how the ambiguity of the text allows for both readings? How you read this depends on whether you think Samuel is with Saul or maybe against him. In verse 17, Samuel summoned the people to Mizpah for the more public demonstration of Saul as king. Saul, however, has chosen to hide among the baggage, and he has to be fetched for his public recognition. Samuel proclaims Saul king, and then explains the regulation of the kingship to the people, and he writes them all down, and then he sends everybody home. Now, Saul doesn't do himself any favors here, seeing as he's hiding among the baggage to avoid what he knows is coming. But he's terrified. He's a walking mess of insecurity. He has no idea how to lead. What's a king even supposed to do? He needs help. Wait, Samuel has just explained the regulations of the kingship. If anybody here knows what Saul should do next, it's gotta be him. Samuel, Saul needs you. I wish the Bible said that from that very day, Samuel and Saul worked together. Saul drinking in Samuel's wisdom and Samuel pouring his knowledge of the Lord into Saul. Don't you think Saul could have been a better king with this kind of mentorship? Now, I would argue that Saul is well aware that he's inadequate for the job. He's hiding, but he is not hiding this. And he's also shown signs that he's teachable with his servant back in chapter 9. He can recognize when he doesn't have all the answers, and he can adopt a plan that makes sense. He just needs a trusted advisor that is in his corner to form and to teach him and to show him how to be a righteous king. Samuel, Saul needs you. The question is, Samuel, are you willing? There are lots and lots of examples of how we can ask that question and see how Samuel does or does not come through. But I'm going to have to choose just one last story. In chapter 13, the Philistines have assembled to wage war against Israel. Things are looking bleak for Saul, as verse 6 describes. When the men of Israel saw that their situation was critical and that their army was hard-pressed, they hid in caves and thickets and among rocks and pits and cisterns. Saul remained at Gilgal and all the troops with him. They were quaking with fear. He waited 7 days, the time set by Samuel, but Samuel did not come to Gilgal. And Saul's men, they began to scatter. And so he said, "Bring me the burnt offering and the fellowship offering." And just as he was finished making the offering, Samuel arrived. And Saul went out to greet him. "What have you done?" asked Samuel. And Saul replied, "When I saw that the men were scattering and that you did not come at the set time, I thought, now the Philistines will come down against me at Gilgal, and I have not sought the Lord's favor. So I felt compelled to offer the burnt offering." "You acted foolishly," Samuel said. "You have not kept the command the Lord your God gave you. If you had, he would have established your kingdom over Israel for all time. But now your kingdom will not endure." And so begins the epic slide into failure that is Saul's kingship. He makes one blunder after another, driven by insecurity, jealousy, and the desperation to prove himself worthy. But don't you wonder, like I do, if Saul's story could have gone differently? Why couldn't Samuel have cut the guy a break and arrived early to make the offering so everyone could prepare for battle? Isn't it just a little too convenient that Samuel arrives just as Saul had finished making the offering? And what's with the fact that 3 later kings, David, Solomon, and Ahaz, they all offer sacrifices as king, but they don't lose their kingdom? So what are we to do with Saul's sad story? Don't forget that God is the one who chose him to be king. Was Saul some pawn to be sacrificed so Israel would see how wrong they were to want a king? Was he inherently vengeful and self-interested, like the Bible study on my shelf described? I have trouble swallowing that. I propose instead that Saul had the potential to be a decent king. He just needed Samuel's help to do it. It sounds more like God to choose someone unlikely, such as Saul, but then slowly transform him into the hero that he sees within him. And in this situation, I think God was hoping to work 2 things at once, because the prophet Samuel, he also has some growing up to do. While he certainly has God on his side, he's also a self-interested and petulant man who would rather see Saul fail just to prove his point, rather than do his part to make Saul into an honorable king for the good of the nation. But aren't we all, depending on the situation, either Saul or Samuel? Sometimes we're the established expert, threatened by change and those that bring it. Are there ways that we can gently and generously share wisdom with those who are in over their heads? And at other times, we're the newbie, striving to appear competent, but really, we're more comfortable hiding among the baggage. Do we admit what we don't know and humble ourselves to seek out guidance? Saul's and Samuel's, they're all around us and they're within us, and they desperately need each other. And if they actually help to make each other successful, then they can all be heroes. So thanks for coming along on this short journey into the Bible text. I hope you've noticed something new in the landscape, or maybe even a fresh way to view territory that you've covered many times before. Whatever the case, it's good to have you along for the trip. You never know what we might discover as we crack open this fascinating text together.